discussion of development and research issues, as well as their implications for agricultural and rural development. Through the ABSS, SEARCA proactively contributes to having a vibrant scientific exchange within and even beyond the Spanish science community. This afternoon's seminar is co-organized by SEARCA, the Program for Biosafety Systems, or PBS, and the National Institute of Molecular Biology and Biotechnology, University of the Philippines, Los Baños. I belong in PBS and Biotechnology. We'd like to thank SEARCA for hosting the event. And welcome to this presentation on legal issues on biotechnology and biosafety. But before we begin, we'd like to request Dr. Ebora, Coordinator of PBS Philippines and Director of Biotech UPLB, to give welcome remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for coming, because we were waiting for the audience to come. We were quite worried that nobody will come because it's Friday and you have to do a lot of cleanup because of Glenda. So thank you. So on behalf of the Program for Biosafety Systems, Biotech UPLB, and SEARCA, we would like to welcome you to this seminar. Our speaker has conducted a training workshop from Monday to Thursday in Manila, and it is sponsored by the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Science and Technology Biosafety Committee, Biotech UPLB, and the three agencies. And there were a lot of discussion during the workshop. It was participated in by scientists, regulators, and lawyers. And there are a lot of issues that were discussed. So I think the seminar this afternoon will be very helpful because we'll be getting additional input from those discussions. So again, welcome to this seminar, and I think it will be a very interesting talk by Atty. Jaffe from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
I'll give a very brief introduction to Atty. Gregory Jaffe. His undergrad is biology and has a law degree from Harvard, so he has a rather rare combination of expertise in both law and science. He is the director of the project on biotechnology for the Center for Science and in the Public Interest. What I learned about it while we were talking the past few days was that they have a guide on how to conduct healthier conferences. We could all benefit from downloading that. We will work with him through the Program for Biosafety Systems. His first trip to the Philippines was with the PBS training back in 2005. We stayed in Makati. We wanted to bring him to Los Baños. There was a storm, so we got stuck in the city. Now, 2014, 9 years after, we are finally able to bring him to Los Baños between Glenda and Inday. Hopefully, we could bring him more in the Philippines and give him some time for side trip in Boracay and Palawan. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Atty. Gregory Jaffe.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank SEARCA for hosting this talk, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. I know it's been sort of a crisis situation here the last couple of weeks, and I saw all the trees down when I was coming by, so you're troopers to all come out here and do that. And I have to say that losing electricity in storms is not something that's also not new to me. I was realizing, thinking about it, that my family's house, which I live in Northern Virginia, we've lost power for a significant period of time, 3 times in the last 7 years because of weather events, including one where we lost power because of a hurricane for 7 days. So you guys are not the only ones who lose power. You'd be surprised at how often we also lose power for these weather events. So I can relate and appreciate you all coming. What I hope to do in the next 40 minutes or so is give you a somewhat different perspective on some of the issues around agricultural biotechnology. And although my talk had originally been called, I guess it was legal issues, critical legal issues, sort of changed the title a little bit to be new battles in the debate surrounding biotechnology and biosafety. And each of these battles I'm going to talk about has a legal component to it, but it has other components to it also. And it's sort of my thoughts on engineering, both in developing and developed countries. So, since I'm the new kid on the block here, I'm going to give you a little background about a little bit about my background and who I work for. Then I'm going to give a little background on genetic engineering, because as a lawyer, one of the things I always learned was the facts are the most important thing. And so it's important everybody know what we're talking about when we talk about genetic engineering and biosafety regulatory systems. And then I am going to focus on 4 topics: liability and redress, socioeconomic considerations, labeling, and resistant weeds. And then I'll end with some conclusions. So, as Carlos said, I have an undergraduate degree in biology and a law degree. I consider myself an environmental lawyer. Before my current job, I worked for 11 years in the U.S. government, 7 in the Department of Justice, and 4 in the Environmental Protection Agency. And pretty much my job as a civil lawyer was to get polluters to clean up the environment. We went against polluters, trying to get them to clean up the environment or pay for the cost of cleanups. However, I have been following agricultural biotechnology for more than 25 years. I did my college thesis on this topic back in the 80s. And for the last 13 years or so, I've been the director of the Biotechnology Project at the Center for Science and the Public Interest, which is a nonprofit consumer organization, an NGO. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, because one of the things I think is important in this debate is everybody has a bias. Everybody comes with a position. And so I want to be above board at the beginning, and so to tell you the lens which I see this technology through, and the background that I have, and that'll give you some perspective. So I work for the Center for Science and the Public Interest. It's a nonprofit consumer group. We're located in Washington, D.C. We were started more than 40 years ago by 3 PhD scientists who wanted to bring science into the advocacy arena on behalf of consumers. We focus on food and nutrition. That's all we really work on, are food and nutrition issues. And one of the founders, Michael Jacobson, is a PhD microbiologist, is still the executive director of the organization. And so we try to advocate and educate based on the best available science out there. We're called the food police in my own country because we tell people what's good and bad about all the food they eat. We tell them, don't drink too much soda, don't supersize it, don't go to McDonald's very often. We tell people to eat more fruits and vegetables, and so, some people call it the food police for that reason. We publish a Nutrition Action Health newsletter. I have no involvement in this, but it's a great newsletter, and we have 900,000 subscribers in the U.S. and Canada. It's one of the largest health newsletters in the world, and it has rankings of products, recipes. It talks about health and diet, and new diet fads, and healthy oils, and a host of different things. But the reason I'm telling you about this is we take no funding from industry, from anybody in industry, and never have in our 40 years of existence, nor from the government, the U.S. government or any other government. And that's really important to us. We don't have any, not only don't we have a direct conflict of interest, but we don't have a perceived conflict of interest. So where do we get our funding? We get our funding from our 900,000 members and subscribers. Each of them pay $10 or $20 a year for the 10 issues of our newsletter, and we ask them for donations. And some give us $5 and some give us $1,000. And they're all just individuals like yourselves in the U.S. and Canada. They're not corporations or anything like that. And that's where we get the vast majority, 90 or 95% of our funding. We do take a little bit of funding from independent philanthropic foundations, a foundation like the Gates Foundation or something like that. We don't take funding from a foundation that's directly linked to a corporation. So we wouldn't take funding from the Kellogg Foundation or the Syngenta Foundation. Each organization has their own rules. We think these rules keep us independent, and so that when we have a message about food or when we go to advocate in Congress, people understand that our message is based on the science and not based on where we're getting our funding in any way. So I run the Biotechnology Project, which has been in existence for 13 years. And when we started, we looked at the current crops being grown in the U.S. and all the safety data around them. And we said in one of our Nutrition Action newsletters that the current crops in the U.S. are safe to eat, that they have some benefits. And while we don't think that was particularly novel decision or conclusion, there aren't too many consumer organizations, NGOs, in the United States or in the world that have said that. And clearly very few have said it as loudly as we do. But we thought that's where the science was on this technology. We do advocate for products being assessed on a case-by-case basis. And especially as a lawyer, I spend a lot of time on biosafety regulatory systems, market, but also to allow safe products to the market, and I'll come back to some of that. So I'm here also on behalf of the Project on Biosafety Systems. I spend about 25% of my time as the legal consultant to that project. And that project is managed by IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, one of the CG centers, the one located in Washington, D.C. And it is a capacity building project for biosafety regulation. And it uses this integrative approach. I'm one of the many technical people on that project, but there are PhD scientists on that project, there are communications experts on that project, and the idea is, again, we're independent, we don't sell any product, but it's to help national governments come up with biosafety regulatory systems so that they can assess for themselves whether they want to pursue genetically engineered crops or not. We don't try to tell people what to do, we try to give them the tools so that they can make their own decisions. And we sort of work on models and best practices, and these are all the countries that we work in. And I've worked in virtually all of those countries at some point. Now, this was my first time I really worked in the Philippines, so I can say that. And as I said, I'm there as a legal consultant. I've done legal biosafety trainings. I help draft biosafety bills, regulations, implementing guidances. I've worked in almost all of the countries that we've talked about, including in Asia. I've done liability and redress workshops in Vietnam and in Indonesia. I've also done a little bit of work for the World Bank and for the UN Jaffe project. But all of that is in the idea of trying to help to give the information that I'm familiar with, the expertise to help people understand biosafety so that they can make their own decisions. So, on to a little bit about background about genetic engineering and biosafety, because I want to make sure we all are talking about the same thing. One of the talks I give in the United States is called Busting the Myths About Genetically Engineered Crops and Foods. And what I find is that a lot of people don't understand what this technology is, and a lot of the issues around it really come, both the risk issues and the perception issues come from what is the technology. And as I said, facts are really important. So, this is a technology that's very controversial. On one side, you have Monsanto saying this is sustainable agriculture, and on the other side, you have, the Russians saying that anybody who's doing GMOs should be punished as terrorists. You have total extremes. And when you have that, how do you figure out what the facts are? How do you figure out what the issues are? And that's sort of what our project at CSBI tries to do. Tries to be an independent purveyor of information so that we can tell, people can look to us to sort of figure out what the facts really are. So, when I'm talking about a genetically engineered organism, I'm talking about scientists moving a beneficial trait from one organism to another in a very precise way. Finding a gene of interest that has a beneficial trait, inserting that gene into the DNA of a plant or an animal cell, selecting for the cell with that insertion, and breeding the plant or animal normally. This is all done with recombinant DNA techniques. I tend to call them genetically engineered organisms. I think that's the better scientific term. But unfortunately, around the world, most everybody calls them genetically modified organisms. So I think those are the same. In the international context, for some of the protocols, they're called living modified organisms. In my mind, all of these are virtually identical terms. But this is the cartoon or the graphic that we used when we tried to explain it to our members, our subscribers. And so you're talking about a situation where you have a DNA, a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. It has a gene of interest. This is a real example. It has a toxin associated, a gene that produces a protein that's toxin for certain pests. So the scientist extracts out that gene. Then you take the corn cell and you try to insert that gene into the DNA of the corn cell. There are two ways to do that. One is the gene gun. Well, there are more than two ways, but the two most common ways have been the gene gun, where you ballistically sort of force it into the cell, force it through the membrane of the cell wall, and even into the nucleus of the cell to the DNA. And then the plant grows with every single one of that cells having that gene. It may have a promoter associated with it that has it expressed in certain parts of the plant than the other. In this case, my example is a pest of toxin that is dead to the corn rootworm pest, and so it's mainly expressed in the roots of the plant. The pest feeds on the roots of the plant, ingests that toxin, it dies, and then the corn plant grows up without that damage. Now I know that there's BT corn here in the Philippines. I'm not sure if it's resistant to a rootworm pest or just to a corn borer, to a pest in the field, but that is an example of what it is. The other way that that gene is introduced is through agrobacterium, in which case the scientist is putting the DNA on the plasmid. Agrobacterium naturally infects plant cells and naturally puts DNA in plant cells. So when you hear the arguments from people, oh, we're doing something unnatural here, you know, that putting DNA from one organism to another, well, naturally in nature, genes go from one organism to another. Agrobacterium does it. Scientists use that to put a gene that they want into it. And so those are the two main methods that are used for. And as I said, it starts in the laboratory. There may be people on this campus doing the transformations. You go to greenhouses, and I was just visiting the Golden Rice in a greenhouse earlier today. Eventually you go to field trials, and eventually you go to commercial release, where farmers are growing this out in the open and getting the benefits of it. And as I said, I know you guys have the Phyllis Theragentous corn that's grown by hundreds of thousands of hectares here in the Philippines. This is not my data, but again, just as background to show you the countries. There are 27 countries that grow genetically engineered crops, all the ones in green that grow them today. By over 18 million farmers. The largest in terms of acreage is my country, but the largest in terms of farmers is actually India and China, each with over 7 million farmers, primarily small-scale farmers. So you know, this technology is scale neutral, which makes it sort of interesting because it can be used in many different applications. These are all the crops that I'm aware of that are genetically engineered, that are commercially grown or grown out in the open around the world, and there are primarily 3 traits that have been engineered so far to date. There are a couple of exceptions, but these are the primary ones. One has been that built-in pesticide that I mentioned, where you're introducing a toxin that will be specific to an insect pest. You also have ones that are resistant to herbicides, so you can you can spray an herbicide over the top of the crop. The herbicide kills the weeds around it, but doesn't kill the crop itself. And then there are also some that are resistant to viruses, papaya and squash in particular, in my country, where they don't get attacked by the virus that would otherwise infect those plants and their fruits. So as I said earlier, we've taken a really hard look at all the information out there about whether eating foods from genetically engineered crops are harmful or not, including looking at the data from both the industry as well as from independent scientists. And our conclusion has been that there are no harms from the food made from current crops that are genetically engineered. And I think, you know, despite what you may read in the newspapers at times, I think there really is a growing international consensus that all reach that same conclusion. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has reached that. The European Food Safety Agency has reached that. The National Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, the FAO, I could go on. But I think that is not really an issue for the current crops that are grown these days, despite what some might say. And I think part of that is also understanding what these crops are used for. And I'm talking mostly about here in the U.S., but I think it's true in lots of other countries. Most of the genetically engineered crops that are grown, the corn and soybeans, are used for animal feed or for industrial purposes. And to the extent they get into our food is usually through highly processed ingredients. Sugar from sugar beets, or corn oil from corn, or soybean oil from soybeans. And when you highly process these, in large case, you eliminate both the DNA and the protein from the crop when you make that highly processed ingredient. And so if I had corn oil from genetically engineered corn in one hand and corn oil from non-genetically engineered corn in the other hand, they'd be biologically and chemically identical. Because the thing that, remember what we did when you engineered a crop, you added some DNA that produced a protein, but oil has no DNA, any at all, not just the added one, and it has no proteins in it. So it is the same. There is some cotton that's grown that's obviously used for things like clothing, and some of these crops are eaten as whole foods. Sweet corn corn is eaten by humans. Squash, papayas are some examples of crops that are eaten whole by human beings. On the other hand, the flip side, industry sometimes wants to tell you that these are nutritionally better for you. I don't think there's any data right now to support that most of the current crops are either nutritionally better or worse for you. They're not engineered for that purpose, although there are beginning to come in very small quantities some crops that do have who have a beneficial trait that is more nutritious. And one of the reasons my organization is involved in this topic is, in fact, we hope that there will be crops like that in the future, whether it's golden rice or high oleic soybeans and so forth. But if there's only one message you take home from my talk today, it's that I really think, and this is not specific just to genetic engineering technology, but almost any technology, you have to look at everything on a case-by-case basis. I think the proponents of this technology want to spend time talking about it generally. I think the opponents want to talk about it generally. This is safe, this is unsafe, and so forth. You really need to look at each specific application and look at the benefits of it, the risks of it, the environmental impacts of it. It's really case by case. And so when you heard me talking about safety, I said all of the current crops. I can't tell you what the future crops are. I can tell you this is not an ultra-hazardous technology, and I would anticipate many of the future crops to be safe, but you've got to look at them case by case. And so, that's one of my most important messages to say. And I think in particular, and many of you work in agriculture or studying agriculture, it all depends on the agricultural system, the receiving environment, what the baseline is. It can be different for different countries and for different diets. And I'll give you just one example. So BT cotton, this is grown, it's cotton engineered with one of those Bacillus thuringiensis genes that produces a toxin. It's grown in the United States, and in the United States, the biggest benefit from that has been a reduction in pesticide use. Cotton farmers used to spend 10 or 12 sprays a year on their cotton. Now they do 1 or 2 sprays a year. And this is well documented. Even critics of biotechnology in my country acknowledge that this particular example has been very beneficial for the environment. That same BT cotton is grown in South Africa. Well, in South Africa, those farmers didn't spray. They used to take a yield loss. So their biggest benefit has been an increase in yield from that. So because they didn't spray, so you can't see a reduction in insecticides. Same product, but in a different environment, having a different benefit. That same crop is grown in China, and in China, they did use some pesticides beforehand, so there is some reduction in pesticide use. There also is some increase in yields, but one of the unusual benefits has been a reduction in farm worker hospitalizations, because the people in China who produced the sprayed pesticides didn't have the same kind of protections that they might have in a place like the United States. And so there were constantly farm workers getting pesticide poisoning and going to the hospital. And one of the indirect benefits in China has been a significant decrease in how many farm workers go to the hospital with pesticide poisoning. So again, the same crop in a very different environment, and you get a different benefit. And so that's my example to show you that you've really got to look at this case by case. And so what might be good for the Philippines might not be good for Vietnam, or might not be good for the US, and vice versa. And so you can't just generalize about this technology. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit in my introduction about biosafety. Do you know that most of the international agreements don't define biosafety related to GMOs? There is not a definition out there. There are definitions of GMOs, there are definitions of other things. There is no definition of biosafety. So I've come up with my own definition, which is principles, technologies, practices, and measures implemented to prevent a GMO from having a potential adverse impact on humans, animals, and the environment. And it's about managing risk. It's not, and I said, potential adverse impacts. It's about managing risks. It's about risk assessment and risk management. It's not. These aren't real risks. They're potential risks. And therefore, I've come up with my own definition of a biosafety regulatory system, which is a regulatory regime for assessing and managing the full range of potential risks that could be posed by GMOs. It's not in the definitive, and it would address human as well as environmental, agricultural, biodiversity, all those type of issues. So the goal of those systems being a couple things. One, to ensure safety to humans and animals, to ensure safety to the environment and agriculture. That's sort of an independent check on those projects. It would be done using risk assessment and risk management, where we're talking about maximizing benefits and minimizing risks. You as scientists know nothing we do has no risk associated with it. So it's not about no risk, it's about managing risks. The airplane I took over here got here safely, but some airplanes don't. And that's a technology we all use, but there has risks. Driving your car has risks. We don't not all get in a vehicle because of that. And it is indirectly providing public confidence as well as alleviating public concern. So when you walk about, when I go to countries, I mean, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which I'm not going to spend time talking about, really is a good starting point for establishing that biosafety regulatory system, because it ensures safety but allows safe products to be commercialized. It talks about transparency, about public participation, but it also talks about science-based risk assessment and being proportionate. So I think that's a good starting point and so forth. So with that background, I want to get to what I call these hot topics. And the reason they're really hot topics is because I think, and this is my own opinion, that to some extent, the people who've been against biotechnology tried for a long time to convince the public that these were unsafe to eat, unsafe for the environment. And to a large extent, they've lost that battle. People, on the whole, farmers use them, find them beneficial, and I think that there's an international consensus that they're safe out there. And so I think that there's a certain other issues that have now come to the forefront in the battle over this technology, and that's what these four hot topics are, I think, are four of those issues. And I think they all have serious legal components to it, which is why I talk about them. The first one being liability and redress. So what is liability? Liability is the legal obligation of a person or a corporation or a government agency. It doesn't have to be an individual. It can be a corporate agency. The university here is a legal entity could be sued to provide compensation for damage resulting from an action they are responsible for. And what is redress? So redress is a remedy or relief with the person who is liable for harm must provide to the person who suffered that harm. And when we're talking about environmental or issues, you can think about restoration, returning to the previous state before the harm. After this hurricane, you can't really restore, it will take a long time to restore all these trees. But you can remediate, you can clean up the harm, you can get monetary compensation, make the payment equal to the harm, or restore that person to being whole. You could get an injunction to prevent that future harm. The idea being you want to make a person whole as if the harm had not occurred. But when you're talking about environmental or biological diversity, it could be restoring that environment or compensating for that loss by protecting another environment. If you can't bring that environment that you've harmed to its pristine state, you could say, well, let's set up a national park, let's protect another piece of environment so the same thing doesn't happen. The reason I give you these definitions is because in the debate over genetic engineered crops and liability and redress, I think people sometimes think this is a new topic solely for genetic engineered organisms, when the reality is this is something we see every day, and there are laws and regulations about liability and redress all the time. And the question really is it somewhat different for GMOs? So the international community spent a number of years negotiating, and I think Greg was one of the people on that negotiating team for the Philippines, a supplementary protocol on liability and redress. So there is a protocol, an international agreement, that solely deals with liability and redress issues for GMOs, for harm that might be caused by a genetically engineered organism to the biological diversity or to the environment. So that treaty talks about damage and defines damage as an adverse effect on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity that is measurable, taking into account scientifically established baselines. And they also talk about it being significant, meaning that it's long-term, it's more permanent, that it really changes the qualitative and quantitative components of that biological diversity, something that won't just naturally come back into being, that it's been permanently lost, kind of thing. So it's like the hurricane here, we lost a lot of trees, but those will come back eventually. They're not permanent. I mean, those particular trees are lost, but the idea that they'll never come back, it's not, that species is not extinct now. They are going to come back, but this treaty talks about things that aren't going to come back, which is really harm something to the extent that it's not ever going to recover to where it was before. So what does this treaty do? And I'm talking about this because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings out there about it. And what it really does is set up an administrative approach. It says, if by chance, and it doesn't say this is going to ever happen, if there's a GMO that's introduced into the environment and it causes harm to biological diversity, it causes harm to the environment, based on those definitions of damage and significance, it says that the government should be able to have an administrative approach to quickly stop that GMO from continuing to harm the environment and maybe to help start restoring the environment. So it sets up an administrative approach which either says that the government can force the person who developed that GMO to start restoring the property or or start restoring that property, or otherwise the government can do that and then try to get the cost of doing it from that operator, from that GMO person. And when you think about it, this seems like a really logical thing. If there is a harm to the environment, you don't want to spend lots of time figuring out who's responsible. You want to quickly get it cleaned up and worry about who's going to pay who later. The idea is to stop the harm from continuing and start restoring it. So, this is what this protocol does. When you hear the debate around it by NGOs and anti-biotech and everybody else, they're talking about all kinds of other things, and they make it sound like this is about a lot of other things. It's not about anything other than, very simply, an administrative way to stop that harm from continuing and beginning to clean it up. It does talk a little bit about civil liability, so a person or an individual going against another one for that harm that might be caused to material or personal damage. So if your farm was hurt or something like that. And it doesn't say you have to do anything, it just says do what your domestic law says. And you can either have new domestic law or existing domestic law on it. And the reason I think this is important is because that's what you hear in the debate all the time. People aren't really worried about harms to biological diversity from GMOs because the likelihood of that happening is very, very small. I mean, crops like corn are not native to begin with. The environment they're growing in is a fake environment. It's in an agricultural setting, which is not a normal ecology to begin with. And even corn that's not genetic engineered needs so many different human inputs to survive. It's not a native species, and so but when you hear the debate about genetic engineering and liability and redress, they're usually talking about an organic farmer whose crop got pollinated from a GMO kind of thing, which, don't get me wrong, could be a real economic harm, but it's not what's covered under this protocol. And so what the protocol does is say, let's do the administrative approach and leave everything else up to domestic law. And so it doesn't cover those civil liabilities that I think most people are worried about related to GMOs. Those would be covered by your domestic law. And so, my conclusion is that a lot of people think, oh, we need to have new laws about GMO liability and redress. But these terms are not new or unique to GMOs. The most likely harms, if at all, from GMOs are these traditional damages and things like environmental pollution, which generally are covered by existing statutes. I mean, if a GMO was to cause pollution to a river, that would be no different necessarily than if oil spilled in that river and caused pollution. And so to the extent that you have a law that deals with the oil pollution, it should also deal with the GMO. And the question is there some reason to treat them differently? In my view as a lawyer is you want to treat similar situations and similar products the same way. And so unless you can come up with a justification for why GMOs should have a different liability scheme, they shouldn't. They just should have the same. And if you did make different laws, you are going to have a significant impact on product development. And so what you see in the international debate these days is a lot of anti-biotech GMOs pushing countries to establish strict liability laws about GMOs, treating this like an ultra-hazardous technology, which it isn't. Treating it like radioactive waste, which we know is dangerous. It's not a potential risk. It is a risk. And because they want to restrict developers and others from coming in the country. They think, and so this is one of those hooks that I'm telling you about that they think is a new way to put a burden on GMOs so that they won't develop and they're less likely to come into the environment. Second issue is socioeconomic considerations. So the protocol, the Cardigan Protocol, which I mentioned, does have a specific provision on socioeconomic considerations. It's Article 26.1, and that's why this becomes a big legal issue, because lawyers have lots of fun trying to parse out the language in different legal documents. And this one is particularly ambiguous. So it says the parties in reaching a decision on import under this protocol or under its domestic measures implementing the protocol. So applies to both imported GMOs and domestic GMOs, may take into account. So that's a may as opposed to a shall or will, which means the lawyers and others mean they don't have to do this. It's discretionary. Now it says consistent with their international obligations. Well, that's really ambiguous because there are international obligations which specifically say you can't use socioeconomic considerations. So, which one triumphs? Which one's more important? And then it says socioeconomic considerations arising from the impact of living modified organisms on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So it gives a fairly narrow focus. And it says especially with regard to the value of biological diversity to indigenous and local communities. So it even narrows it more, it gives a sort of a caveat to that narrowing. So I read this and I say, you don't have to do it. You have to do it consistent with these other obligations, some of which don't allow you to do it. And when you do it, you've really got to focus on harm, impact from socioeconomic harm rising from the impact on conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So you first have to have that harm to biological diversity. And as I mentioned before with liability and dress, I think people think when you talk to the average person, whether in developed or developing countries, the harm they're thinking about for GMOs is not harm to biological diversity, to making a species extinct or something like that. It's more about economic harm, hurting a farmer, hurting an organic farmer, getting sick from eating that GMO, things that are not harm to biological diversity. So, what do we do about socioeconomic impact? There are academics, there are a lot of ag economists and others who can do economic impact assessments and socioeconomic impact assessments, where they look at the benefits, the costs, the risks. They can look at it at a household level. They can do this ex ante, meaning before the product. They can simply do it in a predictive way, or they can do it ex post after the adoption of the technology. And there are some countries that do socioeconomic decision making in their oversight over GMOs. Argentina is a good example where they have both a food and feed safety analysis, an environmental analysis, and then they do what they call socioeconomic analysis. It's really a trade impact. They look and they see, okay, if we adopt GM corn, is that going to hurt or help our imports and exports? But it's very defined. It's a very economic analysis. And the more economic the analysis is, the more repeatable it is, the more likely it's going to pass those other international agreements. There are other countries that exclude it. My country would be an example where we don't look at socioeconomic impacts before we approve the GMO. Our view is that's left to the marketplace. If it's not beneficial, farmers won't adopt it. They're smart businessmen, we don't look at some of those things. Many countries are proposing to use socioeconomic considerations in their regulatory systems, especially in Africa where I work, but they don't have any definitions or standards on them, and many countries are silent on the topic. But it's not so easy, despite the fact that there's a lot of push these days to include this, especially by anti-biotech groups. And when do you do it? Is it voluntary or mandatory? Who does it? Is it the applicant or the government agency? What's the scope of it? When do you do it? Do you do it when you're in a greenhouse, when it's a confined field trial, if you're waiting to its commercial release? But the more important thing is, how is it used in biosafety decision making? Is it part of that or not? Do you stick to purely scientific issues, or do you get into these other issues? My view is you need clear rules and standards if you're going to be doing this. It's got to be evidence-based and reproducible. But it could be a potentially huge requirement that stops or significantly delays GMOs. The broader the requirement, the more likely that requirement will conflict with international law. If you do a very defined more economic cost-benefit analysis, it might be okay with international law. If you do this much broader socioeconomic thing where you might look at displacement of people to the city and other kinds of impacts, it becomes much harder to justify under international law. So, I would raise this as a second issue because I think there's been a lot of push, especially in developing countries, for them to include this in it. And on first glance, a regulator or policymaker says, well, sure, I should include this. But if you look more closely into it, it's problematic. It's problematic because it may be a violation of international law, but it's more problematic also because it won't necessarily give you really useful information, but it may in fact put up a big roadblock to assessing these technologies on a science basis and getting them out to your farmers if they're safe. So I think I look at this as another one of these issues that's being raised by people primarily who want to stop the technology, not raised because they think this is going to add really good, useful information, but they know that this is going to become a huge requirement that really limits potential development. The third topic is labeling, and I know that here your country has a similar current labeling system as my country, but in the United States, labeling is a very hot topic these days, and there's a lot of push for mandatory government-imposed labeling. Labeling is mainly a policy decision, whether you label or something like that, but it has a lot of practical aspects especially about things like enforcement. Most important thing is having it be accurate, which is crucial. And I think it has to be neutral and not misleading. And I think, everybody talks about labeling, again, in this broad sense, but the devil is really in the details. It is not so easy. It's not so simple when you start thinking about it and figuring out regulations and how you're really going to put it into effect with the lawyers involved. Sorry. When people who are pushing for labeling say, well, there are 62 countries or more that require mandatory labeling. And they sort of say, oh, those consumers have choice. Your consumers should also have choice. But when you look at each of the labeling regimes in those countries, there isn't choice. Mandatory labeling has not led to choice. And maybe they would define choice differently than I do, but I label choice meaning a choice between GM and non-GM. So if you went in the supermarket and you could buy GM cornflakes made from GM corn, or you could buy non-GM cornflakes made from non-GM corn, and they'd be next to each other on the aisle, and you can make that choice. But when you look at these 62 or more countries, they don't have that choice. First of all, there are a lot of countries who have mandatory labeling laws, especially in places like Africa where I work, where they don't have any GM foods. They don't grow any GM crops, and so there's nothing labeled in the supermarkets or on the street corners or wherever. So it's easy to label when you don't have anything to label. The European Union has mandatory labeling, and that makes a bunch of those countries. And what happened there is, because Greenpeace and others were spreading rumors and lies about this technology, the food manufacturing companies were worried about putting this label on, that they would lose customers. And so they all source non-GE ingredients. And so if you go in a supermarket in any of the European Union countries, you find very few, if any, GE labeled products. They're just all non-GE. So I don't think that's choice at all. In Asia, there are a number of countries that have labeling, Japan, Korea, and so forth. But they have a number of exemptions. So when you really look at what's labeled in the marketplace, there also isn't anything. Because what they're currently either growing or importing fits into one of those exemptions. So, the only country I can find out there that really has GM foods labeled in choice is Brazil. And I can't explain that why. I have not been down there. So when you think about labeling, I think that the biggest arguments for labeling are safety. People are concerned about the safety of these foods. So they want them labeled so they can avoid them. And they have an idea of right to know. The fact that it should be transparent, that I should know it. But then the question revolves around fairness. Why should they know about this breeding method and not all the other breeding methods that we use, whether we use irradiation or hybrid technologies or cloning and things like that? Is this technology, many of you are scientists, really that different than other technologies we use? And some of those, if we told consumers that your food was irradiated, the seeds, we cause DNA mutations with X-rays or gamma rays or chemicals, they might feel that's scary and want to know about that just as much as the GMO. So, and just because consumers want it, that may be a good reason on one hand, but on the other hand, as a policy matter, if you start labeling everything that consumers want, pretty soon you can't see anything. There's just so many things on the label. So, I think as a legal matter, you've got to keep with precedent and set up a standard, and if it doesn't meet that standard, not do it. And as I said, it's got to be accurate and not misleading. I mentioned that corn oil situation. Is it misleading to label corn oil GE, when in fact it has no genetic engineered content in it, it has no DNA, it has no protein, it's biologically and chemically the same? But if one says GE corn oil, the other one says non-GE corn oil, I think that's misleading and not accurate. Others may differ. I'm not saying it says derived from, it just says GE corn oil, because that's what most of these labeling laws would require. But those people aren't eating anything So you got to fit any labeling into your existing law. You have to educate consumers about it. And clearly, potentially, it may have a negative impact on the technology development. Some of these laws are really meant to it to be a warning symbol on the label. It's not, oh, just in the ingredient list. It's right out there in the front of the package. Contains GE ingredients or something. And sometimes it's written in a way that, you know, says genetically engineered or something. That sounds scary. It doesn't say, you know, produced through modern biotechnology. It's sort of meant to be a warning. In my country, there have been a number of initiatives. So there have been a couple laws passed, state laws. The state initiatives did not pass. The state initiative is when each of the citizens votes on it, whereas a law would be something passed by our elected leaders in the state legislators. So there were laws passed in Maine and Connecticut, but they're contingent. They don't come into effect until enough other states pass it. But there was recently a law passed in Vermont that will have genetically engineered foods labeled starting in 2016, although it's being challenged by the industry in court. And they may win that challenge based on constitutional issues. But here's a statement from somebody in the United States who pushes for mandatory labeling. And he's really, from the director of the Organic Consumers Association, he really tells you his motivation. It's not about consumer choice. He says once these foods have to be labeled, stores won't sell them, consumers won't buy them, farmers will stop growing them. So he admits this is not about choice and transparency. It's about an indirect way of stopping this technology from moving forward. So in my country, they have some voluntary, mandatory labeling. Voluntary meaning some companies have said, we're going to label things. We've decided ourselves we're going to label it. One of them is Chipotle, and this is on their website where they do label the G for that soybean oil. And then they have their little statement out about genetic engineering, and if you read the statement, what it really says is, well, we're labeling for now, but our goal is really to get rid of these. So they're not sort of saying, we label them and we think they're safe and we're just doing that for transparency. They really have a marketing issue here. They're going to make themselves be non-GM, and they think they're going to get some competitive advantage in the marketplace. It's like saying, my coffee's, free trade, or my tuna fish is dolphin safe, and that's fine. People can do that on their own. But the question is whether, in this case, they're doing something misleading to consumers about the safety of those crops. Whole Foods, which is not exclusively, but a very large organic and whole food supermarkets in our country, also said in March 2013, they made this big announcement. We're committed to full GMO transparency by giving suppliers 5 years to source non-GMO ingredients or to clearly label their products containing GMOs. And they said, we're going to have everything you'll be able to tell whether everything in our store is GMO or non-GMO. Then they talk about, what progress, and 6 months later they said on their website, the progress they had to date. And what they say is, if you read this, it's sort of saying, we're really working with everybody to tell them not to source GM. And so in 2018, it's not going to be a store where you can choose, it's just going to be a totally non-GMO store. And again, they have a right to do that, it's a private business, but they were misleading the public by sort of saying, well, we're going to label these. They're not going to label them, they're forcing all their suppliers to not label them, to eliminate them, and if you can't eliminate them, then take your product to a different store. If you want to do non-GMO in our country, you can do organic, because organic doesn't allow genetically engineered seeds. But we also now have, in our country, and you might see it soon in your country, I don't know, private certifiers. The Non-GMO Project has come out and said, we're going to certify products as non-GMO if you want to come and pay us money and follow our standards. And that might be okay if they were neutral about this. And they say they've already identified, have more than 14,000 products. But when you read their website, they spread all this information about how unsafe these are. And so I know a lot of companies that are food companies who talk to me and say, well, we don't want to go with that because they have an agenda. It's a political agenda. It's not, oh, we're a neutral certifier. They have an agenda and they don't agree with their agenda. So, I raise all this because I think you can have misleading both on the GMO side and also on the non-GMO side. So here's a non-GMO certified product, Planters All Fruit. It's like a jam, made out of strawberries, and they don't use sugar. They use, you know, natural, all natural things in it. And you can't read all this, but when you read it, you realize there's nothing in here that could come from a genetically engineered crop, even highly refined, because it's made of strawberries. Pretty much it's just all fruit, because that's what it's called. It was called all fruit. Okay, and there aren't genetically engineered strawberries. So I would argue that's misleading again to the consumer, because they're telling them we've eliminated something that never existed. Okay, another example, quinoa flour. Here we've got the non-GMO. Okay, what do you think the ingredients for quinoa flour is? Quinoa is a grain, one of these ancient grains. Well, the only ingredient was whole grain quinoa flour. Well, and there's no genetically engineered versions of quinoa. So again, you start the situation where people are trying, for marketing reasons, to make a distinction out of something that's not distinguishable. So, you know, I think you have to make sure you have an independent determination of safety, a government doing that, so that people don't think these are unsafe. And I think eventually you have to figure out ways to be more transparent. But you don't need to have mandatory labeling, and you don't, as I can say, you have to worry about, I worry as a lawyer, about all these misleading aspects, all these inaccurate aspects, and so forth that I think do come about. The final topic I'm going to go through very quickly, because I want to end and get to questions, is resistant weeds and sustainability. So I think the last battle that's going on over genetically engineered crops, or another of these hot topics, is this issue of what is their impact on the environment and on whether they're sustainable. And I'll give the example of glyphosate-resistant crops, glyphosate-tolerant crops in the U.S. Glyphosate is a very good herbicide, about as good as it gets in the sense of it being easy to use and quickly breaks down the environment. That's probably the lowest environmental footprint of herbicides. But we grow 130 million acres of it a year in the United States. And on the plus side, we've seen a great increase in no-till or conservation till practices, which really means you're not losing topsoil and you're not having runoff into your soil and any chemicals in the soil into your groundwater or into your surface waters. So big environmental benefits from using this technology. But we've also now have 14, since the introduction of those genetically engineered crops, we have 14 weed species in 22 states that are now resistant to glyphosate. Primarily from, I would argue, from overuse and misuse of this technology. And here's the example. This is from Syngenta, one of the companies. So they started genetic engineered Roundup Ready soybeans in 1996. Here in 1998, we have one resistant weed just in California. 2004, we have 5 resistant weeds in a much broader area. 2008, we have 10 resistant weeds. And look at the area now being covered. In 2012, we have 14 resistant weeds. And, like, you know, huge swaths of the United States with resistant weeds. An industry prediction was that there are 61 million acres. So half of the acreage now is resistant weeds on, which means farmers have to start using a second herbicide or a different herbicide. And farmers, 50% of the farmers said they have at least one resistant weed. So the industry solution has been use multiple herbicides. Well, one of the advantages of this technology was you're going to use one herbicide and it's going to be relatively benign. Now you're going to more dangerous ones. Or other herbicide-tolerant crops, stacking those crops so that you're still, again, using multiple herbicides. So, my organization has been trying to push the government to impose some mandatory restrictions. I think weed scientists would say this was predictable. It's also easy to prevent. In the developed country scenario, you have to rotate your crops and rotate your herbicides. And if you do both of those, the technology is sustainable. But that's not what's happening. So we're trying to push the industry and the government to require that. It's not necessarily the position that a lot of people like to hear. But my view is this is sustainable if you use it in a judicious manner. If you use integrated weed management, if you rotate your crops, if you rotate your herbicides. And so, my answer is that you can use this more sustainably, or agriculture can be fairly sustainable with this. It depends on how you use it. But unfortunately, in industrial agriculture, people like to take that new thing and use it to death, and then it does die out here. So I hear a lot about this, especially in my country, but around the world. They're worried about this. And so it's something that we've got to do a better job of because it is a potential, red flag against this technology. So I'm quickly going to conclude. Is biotechnology a silver bullet? It's not. It's not a panacea for world security. It's not going to solve every agricultural constraint, but it can solve specific farmer issues. It can provide benefits to farmers, to the environment, and hopefully to consumers, and it can be applied safely. I firmly believe that. It's still going to be controversial. There's no question about it. But I think the dominoes are falling. I think Europe's the outlier. I think all the rest of the world is going to come around and grow this technology. And Europe is losing scientists every day because they're not allowed to do research in this area. And I think Asia is clearly a big, where there's lots of research going on in this technology. What are my take-home messages? I mean, I think the safety of GM crops is well documented as well as their benefits. But I think that there are some new battlegrounds that potentially prevent or delay applications of this technology from moving forward. Those include what rules you set up for liability redress, what you decide to do about socioeconomic considerations and how that plays, if at all, into your regulatory system, what kind of labeling you have, if you have labeling, and how you manage the technology and whether it's sustainable or not. So, that's my talk. I hope I've given you a little different thought of a way to think about some of the issues around this technology. Think about how we move forward on this, both at a country level and at an international level. I have a website. I have lots of publications that are freely downloadable, articles. I have frequently asked questions about the facts around genetic engineering crops and animals. Feel free to go to that. You can download anything I have there. Here's my email address. If I don't answer your questions today and you have other questions in the future, feel free to email me. Remind me that you heard me speak at SEARCA, and I'll do my best to answer them. But I'm happy to open it up now to questions or discussion.
Any questions? When you do ask questions, please state your name and your affiliation. Ma'am Ola.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for the very nice talk. We've been wanting to go to the workshop, but you were not allowed. Okay. My question is, there were 4 considerations that you presented, and I was wondering about insect resistance, because we know that there's also a lot of hectarage on biotech, on GM crops with insect resistance, BT, and other genes with insect resistance. What is the current scenario in terms of building up of insect resistance in those genes, insect resistance genes?
So I could have also talked as equally about insect resistance as I did about weed management. I just had limited time. I think the weed side is much more pronounced. At least in my country, we are seeing resistant corn rootworm pests developing in pockets around the country. And I'm specific about corn rootworm. So corn borer, BTs to corn borer have been very effective, in part because of the refuge requirements that we've required in our country, and in part because of the uniqueness of that particular toxin. So the toxins that we use for corn borers are considered high dose, and so they really are very high lethality to the insects. And so the likelihood of a resistant one surviving in the field, especially when you have multiple toxins, is very, very small. And so we see no resistance at all in the corn borer population. And in fact, one of the big benefits in my country has now been that the corn borer population is so low that even organic and non-biotech farmers have to spray a lot less because it just is, we've been little by little killing off this population of corn borers. The corn rootworms, on the other hand, there are, they've documented resistance to 1, if not 2, of the different toxins. And in part that's because they are a moderate dose. They're not as fully lethal. So the insect doesn't, it's described to me with entomologists, the insect doesn't die right off, it goes off and can live for a few days and still feed and so forth and so on, and maybe mate. And so you have a situation where it's a combination of the biology of that particular pest as well as the the biology of that particular toxin. So we are seeing that, and it's not anywhere near the acreage of the resistant weeds. I mean, I think they're thinking it's in the tens of thousands to maybe in the low hundreds of thousands of acreage. But again, we're growing 30, 40 million acres of BT corn around in our country. So it's still relatively small in different pockets. But there is a worry that it's going to continue, and they're definitely trying to figure out with the scientists the best method to try to prevent it from happening.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yes, please.
We have some seed developers who are, in terms of the BT, the refuge in the back. What is the predominant seed packets in the U.S.? Which ones they use? The commonly used by farmers. What type of seed packets with the refuge seeds?
So up until very recently, farmers would buy. So farmers in the United States were required to have a 20% refuge originally when they had a single toxin BTs, and for the rootworm it was an in-field refuge, meaning it had to be in rows next to the field. For corn borer, it was within a half mile, so it could be in a nearby field but not in the same field. And so farmers had to purchase two different kinds of seeds. They had to purchase the BT seeds and the non-BT seeds and change out their planters and plan their farming around doing that. And therefore there was not the greatest compliance because it took time, which is money for farmers, and they didn't want to do it. Little by little, now that they have pyramided, stacked and pyramided genes, pyramided meaning pyramid is different than stack. Stack would be two traits in the same corn. It might be herbicide tolerant and BT. A pyramided one will have two toxins that go against the same insect. And so the argument being, if the insect survives the first toxin, it dies with the second toxin, then you have a multiplication effect. The likelihood of a resistant bug developing is a magnitude greater, much greater magnitude less. Somebody who's a statistician and probability could explain it better than I can. So now that we have these pyramided products, they've gone to 5% refuges, and they've also gone to refuge in a bag. So they mix the refuge seeds in a bag and plant them so they're randomly, so you might have a bag of seeds which has 95 or 90% not BT seeds and 5 or 10% non-BT seeds. And they're random. And the industry and agencies sort of claim to believe that still gives you the necessary population of non-resistant bugs such that if a resistant pest develops, it still mates with a non-resistant pest and you don't have the next generation of resistant pests developing. That again may work better for one kind of insect than the other. It might work better for the corn rootworm insect, which has a life that really stays very close to the individual plant. It may not work as well for the corn. No, it actually may work better for the corn borer because they move from plant to plant. But for the corn rootworm, which tends to stay very close to a plant, if he's not near a resistant population, then a non-resistant population, then it may lead to resistance developing. So the science is very critical in all of this, but that increases the refuge in a bag clearly increases compliance by farmers because it's passive compliance. You automatically buy the bag and you see they've color coded the seeds. You'll see the yellow seeds and then you might see a purple colored seed, which is the non-BT seed in the bag randomly put into the planter.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Hello. Floating liability and redress issues in the protocol and in the scientific fora gives hint that perhaps GMOs are not really safe because there is a liability and redress issues. Are there cases that are really progressed since GMOs came into this scientific field?
So you're right. If you say, oh, we need this special liability redress provision, it suggests that somehow this is an ultra-hazardous technology. And I would argue it's not ultra-hazardous, and it doesn't need any special rules for liability and redress. The international community didn't agree with me, and they came up with this protocol, but as I said, the protocol is, what they do with the protocol I actually agree with. The administrative approach, I think, is the fine one. When you look at GMOs being grown for 16, 17 years now around the world, there's no documented harm to biological diversity or the environment that I'm aware of in anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And that doesn't surprise me because, again, we're talking about, you know, agricultural systems which are not normal anyway. They're not part of the world's normal ecology. They are man-made ecological zones. And growing corn or soybeans or cassava, whatever you're growing on them, most of those aren't native plants. I mean, you know, soybeans are native to China. They're not native to Philippines. And corn comes from Mexico. It wouldn't, you know, it's only cotton here because of humans. So I wouldn't expect harm to biological diversity because you're only changing one gene in it. So I wouldn't really expect much harm to biological diversity. Now we might eliminate all the corn borer pests. I guess somebody could say that's a harm to biological diversity, although I don't think any of us want them. So, you know, it's like if we could get rid of all the mosquitoes that have malaria, should somebody have to pay for the extinction of that species? Or we'll all clap our hands because now we have no more malaria, I think. So some species that some people might say, you know, all species deserve to live. I think we would say that's not necessarily true. There have been cases of harms, economic harms, and there have been plenty of those cases, especially in my country. We've had situations where unapproved events have gotten out and caused trade problems. So in Japan, when we had an unapproved event, it literally rice that got out and farmers grew it, and so it wasn't approved for human consumption here in the U.S., nor was it approved in Japan, and so Japan just stopped importing any of our rice, and farmers who then got nice premiums for selling and importing rice lost money, and the farmers couldn't even sell the rice in the United States because it wasn't legal to sell it, so they had an economic harm, and they went after Syngenta, the company, to get back that, and most of those cases were settled, but there was...
That's Bayer, that's Syngenta.
Oh, it was Bayer, okay, Bayer. Sorry, excuse me, wrong company. But Syngenta was BT11, corn. BT10. Right, wrong case, but there have been a couple instances where you've had economic harms pursued by farmers. I'm not aware of any cases where an organic farmer has pursued a biotech farmer and won. There was a case in Australia recently where they threw out the case against it. So I think there have been these trade or economic harms, and there have definitely been those type of things. But I'm not aware of any biological diversity, environmental, agricultural harm from any of the growing of these crops. Of course, there are going to be impacts. I mean, and that's why you get to the socioeconomic thing. I mean, you know, just like people using mechanized agriculture was an impact. And if you don't have to, you know, if you hire people to pick weeds and now you don't have to pick weeds because you can spray Roundup over them, people are unemployed. But, you know, so I'm not sure society has a right to say that's the way it should be. We're never going to stop progress and let people just, you know, any technologies, all technologies have impacts. So if that answers your question about the cases, there are more cases, and I talked about them earlier in the week. There are a lot of cases about constitutional challenges, about, you know, approving GMOs being illegal and things like that, going to the safety issues, but not the liability and redress.
More questions? Beyond the golden rice.
Not really questions, but comments.
I'm happy to have them.
Yeah, it's very difficult to address liability and redress, simply because when you want to assess liability, you should have baseline data. What is there before and what is there after the use of the technology. Second, SEC, the socioeconomic consideration. I think it's very difficult to use socioeconomic consideration in assessing the biosafety of GM crops. because it's difficult to address that by science. Maybe policy consideration. It can come in during policy, trade issues, and something like that. Next, weed resistance and insect resistance development. These are to be expected because we are dealing with biological things, biological things. They would respond to stress, and part of response to stress is to develop resistance to that stress. Even human beings, plants, animals, we continue to evolve. The corn that we eat thousands of years ago are different from the corn that we have today. So we continually evolve. Nothing is static. We continually accumulate mutations or changes in our DNA. Next is the role of communication. The anti-GMs would always say genetic pollution. As a scientist, I would call it genetic enhancement, because you are accumulating new genes to better equip you to survive in an environment, whatever biological being it is.
Sorry. Were you done or?
Yes, I'm done.
I don't disagree with any of those points. I mean, I think, the environment is dynamic and always changing, and if we can't, people tell me, we can't all go back to the garden of Eden, and so when I look at a genetic engineered crop and so forth, I look at, well, what is the right, what are we using today, and how is that better or worse for farmers and others, and that's why we support these, because we think they're better. Where there are a lot of people who say, well, we want all organic, and until we get there, we're not going to take a baby step, even though I would argue that genetic engineering is a baby step because it can be used more sustainably. So I completely agree with you. You can't. You have to figure out what your baseline is, but the environment is constantly changing, and you can't all of a sudden make assumptions about something. So I agree with you there. And the socioeconomics, yes, I mean, that's what I argue for, is to the extent that you can do a specific economic analysis, a risk-benefit analysis, that's fine. As a lawyer, I want clear rules and predictable rules. Lawyers want clear rules and predictable rules. And developers and others, people want to know what is the hurdle I have to meet. And the hurdle can't keep changing. And everything has to be reproducible. So my view is, if you can have a socioeconomic thing where 3 people, if you told them the rules, all come up with the same answer, then that's a good rule. But if you don't have rules and 3 people come up with completely different things, then it's not predictable and it's not fair, because you don't know in advance what the standard is that you've got to meet. So I agree. To the extent you're going to use them, and I'm not a big proponent of them, I come from a U.S. government. I come from a U.S. society which pretty much says leave all of that to the marketplace, and I tend to buy in with that. But I agree that I think it's very hard to do in a fair manner. In terms of the resistance, I agree that resistance is going to develop, but I don't agree that we can't figure out ways to postpone it from developing and have better techniques to do that. And if one of the justifications for GE is that it does have these benefits, well, if the benefits are only going to accumulate for 5 years, I'm less of a supporter than if they're going to accumulate for 15 years. And so I'm of the view, let's try to figure out how to use them in a more sustainable way, in a more integrated way, to have them be beneficial not just for today's farmers, but for the next generation of farmers. And I know that's somewhat contradictory to some of the biotech companies and others who want to get penetration in the market and care less about, they think, oh, well, by the time this one loses efficacy, we'll have the next one coming out. I'd rather go with the idea of let's use them in a judicious, sustainable manner and try to have the longevity and get that benefit for a much longer period of time. So I don't disagree with you that scientifically these things happen, and they happen with non-GE crops and non-GE pesticides and things like that. But I don't think that's a justification for not trying better with what
That's
we
why
have.
we have the IRM, the insect resistance management, and weed resistance management.
Right, but in my country we get no weed resistance management. So IRM has worked fairly well for PAPs, for the corn borer, not worked so well for the corn rootworm, but we had nothing for weed resistance, and we're seeing the penalty for it. And so I'm advocating for the new ones, we should have some oversight, some management used. Anybody else? Well, as I said, I'm happy to answer other questions. If you have them in the future, feel free to email me. If you're ever in DC, email me. I'll meet you for coffee or something. But I've really enjoyed my trip here to the Philippines.